All right, time now for perspective. And today's segment is on illegal ivory. The reasons for eliminating the bloody trade are irrefutable and numerous: animal welfare, environmental conservation, and security. Every year, poachers kill about 30,000 elephants, and Europe has been the world's largest exporter of legal ivory, most of which ends up in Asian markets. Now, recently, 32 African countries on Friday called on the European Union to tighten its ban on ivory trade at a conference in Botswana. Today's guest was at that conference. Bert Wander joins us from the international NGO Avaaz in London. Mr. Wander, thank you for speaking to France 24. Just wanted to find out what came out of the event in Botswana. Was any progress made?
Well, it was a hugely significant moment, an unprecedented step for 32 African countries, including 3 presidents, to add their name to a petition calling on Europe to shut down its enormous ivory trade. Now, this is crucial. Europe's facing a choice. It has to choose between elephants or ivory. It can't have both. What we see is Europe's become a hub, a transit point, and the world's largest exporter of ivory. And we know that ivory is being sold in Europe as legal ivory, which is actually being sold illegally. This is a huge problem with elephant populations crashing, and so we're calling on them, together with 1.2 million people around the world, to shut down this trade.
And I think some people would be surprised to learn that the UK singled out in that conference in Botswana as being a major culprit itself.
Well, the UK was the largest component of the EU ivory trade, but they've just agreed to shut down all of their trade and do many of the things that we want to see happen in the rest of Europe. Basically, there are restrictions in Europe on ivory, but there's also enormous loopholes. Anyone who has ivory, wherever they've got it from, as long as they say it is antique, is able to sell it, no questions asked. That's clearly a very, very serious situation, because it means that it's impossible to police the ivory trade. It means legal ivory is sold in Europe, and it makes it impossible to tackle the criminal gangs and the mafias that are driving elephants to extinction. At the same time, Europe's selling enormous amounts of ivory to the very markets that are driving the destruction of elephants in Africa by fueling demand. And so we need that to stop as well, both the trade inside Europe and the export trade that's fueling demand in the Asian countries.
But Mr. Wander, if you could take us through that. We have these bans, but that doesn't necessarily reduce the demand. How do we reduce the demand?
Well, I mean, it's a multifaceted approach is going to be needed. Obviously, we need to tackle the criminal element of the trade. We need to do awareness raising in Asia, and Avaaz members have been funding advertising in Asia and investigations into the illegal trade in Africa to tackle this. But really, the legal markets are the low-hanging fruit in tackling this. We know that ivory traders everywhere use legal markets as a way of converting illegally poached ivory into a product that they can sell all over the world. If we shut down those legal markets, we take a direct hit at their business model. And we make it much easier, because all ivory is illegal, it becomes much easier to police. So it's going to take everyone to do everything they possibly can. Europe has this huge trade. It could shut it down in just a couple of months if it wanted to, and that's what we're calling on them to do. As you say, 32 African countries have joined. Hong Kong's calling for it, China's calling for it, 1.2 million people from all over the world are calling for it, and the question is, are Europe going to listen?
Yeah, as you mentioned, Hong Kong, China, even the United States, either announcing or implementing these new bans. Why has Europe dragged its feet thus far?
Well, I think that there's been a perception for some time that the legal market is somehow different from the illegal market. Now, all the evidence that we're getting through now shows that. Avaaz has paid for a study, and the initial sample that we did, where we bought ivory legally from across Europe, we tested it at Oxford University, and proved that this ivory was not antique. It was post-1947 ivory, sold illegally, passed off as antique ivory. So it's very clear that this trade The legal trade and the illegal trade are two sides of the same coin. It makes no sense for Europe to continue to treat these two issues separately. They're the same thing, and we need to treat them as the same thing. Right now, Europe has a policy of reducing demand for a product in Asia in order to save elephants, while selling that same product to countries across Asia. It makes no sense, and that's why we're calling for a consistent policy. Europe does a lot of good work fighting the illegal wildlife trade, but it can't be a leader in this fight if it's presiding over one of the biggest ivory markets on the planet.
And what about, should any of the blame go to the Asian countries? As you mentioned numerous times, Asian market quite significant in this illegal ivory trade. Hong Kong announcing that ban, but from what I understand, that's not going into effect for a few more years.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, we would love to see bans in place everywhere as soon as possible. And, you know, I don't think this is necessarily about pointing the finger and blaming any particular government or country. This is a global problem. What we want to see is every country around the world doing its bit to solve it. That means the African countries really taking law enforcement seriously. It's the Asian countries shutting down the markets, doing everything they can to reduce demand. And countries like Europe, which is part of this global trade, and they need to do everything they can. Now, the simplest first step that they can take is shut down this legal market. It's not going to be a silver bullet that saves elephants on its own, but as part of a global push, we can do this. And people everywhere want that to happen. And that's really why we're running this campaign.
Indeed, I'll echo that sentiment. Hope you guys make progress in that regard. Thank you for speaking to us, Bert Wander from Avaaz.
Thank you very much.